Scenes of urban warfare as Cairo descends into chaos. Pro and anti-government supporters face off into the early hours of the morning. Welcome to Al Jazeera's live and continuing coverage of the battle for Egypt as events in the country take a violent turn. 2300 GMT, 1 o'clock in the morning in Egypt. I'm Darine Abu Gaida. The main developments coming right now, fighting over Egypt's future. Hundreds hurt in pitched battles between supporters and opponents of President Hosni Mubarak. Government supporters attempt to break the anti-Mubarak occupation of Liberation Square, but the mass protest is still there. Meanwhile, troops hold their strategic positions but fail to act. Hours later, the military urge people to get off the streets. Well, after days of largely peaceful protests in Egypt, the tone has changed dramatically after a day of fierce battles around the edges of Tahrir Square, that's Liberation Square. There are still flames rising as petrol bombs fly across makeshift barricades. The health ministry is reporting that 3 people have died and more than 1,500 injured. As the president's backers attacked the protesters in the square, our teams on the ground saw men destroying buildings and pavements and using the debris as missiles. We can now speak to one of our correspondents on the ground for an update on the situation right now. Tell us where you are and what you see.
Well, I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm right at the north end of Tahrir Square at the border. That's Liberation Square, right? That's a long road leading to a smaller square where now the anti-government protesters have managed to make their way all the way up that road, which is where previously the pro-Mubarak supporters were standing off with them. They've now managed to cordon off a corner using steel barriers, which is right on the corner past the museum facing a flyover. The pro-Mubarak supporters have retreated to the flyover. There are definitely less on that bridge than there were about an hour and a half ago, but still probably a couple of hundred. Both sides exchanging firebombs, Molotov cocktails. There's a couple of cars burning in the foreground. The anti-government protesters are banging on those steel barricades, chanting slogans for Mubarak to step down. We're also hearing reports that there might be plans, now this is all unconfirmed of course, for some pro-Mubarak supporters. They were planning in the early hours of this morning in the day to throw gas cylinders down from rooftops onto the supporters. Now, of course, we can't confirm this, but this is something that's been mentioned in the sense that, you know, this situation remains very tense. People are afraid of what's happening here, and really the army not doing anything to intervene. This is being played out without any form of state control or intervention.
So it doesn't sound like, from what you're saying, that this is going to die down anytime soon.
No, it doesn't seem to be dying down. This standoff has been ongoing for about 2 hours now, and yes, there are less Mubarak supporters than there were before, but the scenes are still of people throwing petrol bombs at each other, retreating, moving forward. But what's, it's quite incredible the way that the anti-government supporters have managed to now, what I can see, create 2 barriers leading into this main road that leads to the square. They've got one which is sort of the front line, which is just around the corner of the museum, and then they have a second barricade that has also steel gates, as it were, and also a couple of vehicles, creating a barrier to not allow any of the pro-Mubarak protesters to actually get access to the square.
I was speaking to a doctor who was on the scene a little earlier on in Liberation Square, and he said that there were fierce clashes going on a few minutes ago when I spoke to him right in front of the National Museum. I don't know if you can see what's going on by the National Museum, but if you can you tell us what's going on there and whether the National Museum has been damaged in any way? Because there were reports as well of a fire nearby. That was earlier on this evening.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly where we are, and this is exactly where everything is taking place. Basically, if I can explain to you a little bit of the of the geography, this main road, which is a northern access area into the square, the museum is at the far end of it. This is around perhaps 800 meters or so down from the square. Now, the anti-government protesters have managed to secure that entire street and have managed to cordon off the corner of the museum. So, as it were, the entire museum's front has got anti-government protesters, and then on the corner, which there's a flyover opposite, is where the pro-Mubarak supporters are. There are Molotov cocktails being sent back and forth. We have seen small pockets of fire erupt on the outside wall of the museum, but they've now been they've died down. The museum, as far as I can see, has absolutely no fire going on. Before we had one incident of black smoke coming up from the front of it, but again, this was on the road and not in the museum itself. And it's worth noting that the military actually has a control point in that museum. They have as it were, a sort of master control room. We know that because when our journalists got arrested, that's where they were taken. So there is a military command very, very close to where this is all happening, and yet they're doing nothing about it. Actually, when these clashes that you're seeing erupted a couple of hours ago, there were 3 tank stations in exactly that location, and what they did was simply pull back and allow this to unfold without any kind of intervention whatsoever.
All right, thank you very much for bringing us that update. Well, we can now get a roundup of the day's events with Tom Ackerman.
Unhappy with Hosni Mubarak's refusal to quit now, the pro-democracy crowds in Tahrir Square continue their protest vigil. Government supporters massed to confront them. Suddenly, they charged the crowd, hurling stones and wielding sticks. Some of the attackers mounted on horseback and camels, trying to push the vigil participants back. At least 6 of the riders were dragged off their mounts and beaten by the protesters. As night fell, the government side employed petrol bombs. A nearby mosque was turned into a field hospital to treat the casualties.
There is many people coming here injured by cut wounds, lacerated wounds, fractures, and ruptured blood. There is deep lacerated wounds, and many people come exhausted from these injuries.
The pro-democracy camp accused the police of instigating attacks and said some of the people were found to be carrying police ID cards. But the Interior Ministry denied that their officers were involved. Mohammed al-Baradei, an opposition figurehead, has demanded that the army step in to quash the violence. The military urged the anti-Mubarak protesters to leave the streets, but after letting the government supporters enter the square, soldiers stood aside as the skirmishes went on. And later in the night, fire and smoke was seen near the square. How much longer the army might stay on the sidelines, a factor that could determine Egypt's onward course. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera.
Well, we've seen the thousands of pro-democracy demonstrators on the streets for more than a week now, but now the president's supporters have begun to make their presence felt in the country, and Jackie Rowland has been speaking to some of them in Cairo.
President Mubarak still has his supporters. They've been silent for days, but now here they come. First in groups of 10 or 20, then in their thousands, heading towards the television building in central Cairo. The opposition has its slogans, and the Mubarak people will not be outdone. A day after the crowds in Tahrir Square shouted, "Leave, leave, leave," these demonstrators are demanding that the president stay. While the army is staying neutral, there's no doubt about where the police's loyalty lies. They are openly in the Mubarak camp.
Please, we are Egyptians. All these people Egyptians, no foreigners. We like Mubarak. We want Mubarak.
The two sides dangerously close. Then the Mubarak supporters start to move towards the square. A wave of thousands surging forward. First on foot, then on horseback, and mounted on camels. The army tries but ultimately fails to keep the two sides apart. The square, a scene of celebration for days, is now the front line in the struggle for Egypt's future.
As we're saying, it's been a day of violence in the Egyptian capital, but Cairo isn't the only place where people have taken to the streets. Al Jazeera has received these pictures right there, allegedly from the historic town of Luxor, that's in southern Egypt. We aren't able to independently verify their exact location, but protesters chanting anti-Mubarak slogans marched through the streets of the popular tourist destination. Plus, from Mansoura, that's 120 kilometers north of Cairo, we have these exclusive pictures from Tuesday. Thousands of people marched through the streets and gathered at a central square in the city where they called for Mubarak to stand down. Neither the police nor the army appear to have been at that protest. And these were the scenes earlier in the day in Egypt's second city, Alexandria. There, like in Cairo, clashes broke out between pro and anti-Mubarak supporters. Okay, do stay with us here on Al Jazeera for live and continuing coverage of the battle for Egypt. And still ahead, could instability spread across the region? We take an in-depth look. And breaking down the barricades online, how Egypt got its internet access back. That's coming up.
The European Tour